By all rights, 1958's The Blob shouldn't be a great movie. It's a relatively small, domestic, independent film. Its scale is small, filmed primarily in the town of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Its budget was a mere $110,000. It got second billing in a double feature with I Married a Monster from Outer Space. It has a small cast, supplemented with Phoenixville's townsfolk. In fact, during the famous run out of the theater, half of the terrified theatergoers are smiling and laughing. It has the least convincing teenagers ever seen in cinema, including a very green Steve McQueen at the ripe age of 28. And what is with that theme song?
And glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob.
But despite all this, even because of it, The Blob is a great film. Somehow it has become one of my favorite films, and certainly one of my favorite 1950s science fiction films. If I was really going to try and pin it down, much of its appeal is that it is such a perfect microcosm of the time period and the genre. It is a well-made film in its own right, competently scripted, acted, and shot, yeah. But it's also the perfect 50s drive-in midnight movie flick. It's not just a monster movie. It's a monster movie with rogue, unruly teenagers hot-rodding around, frustrating the square adults. It's a monster movie with a midnight monster movie in it. It even has the courtesy of ending in a 50s diner. It's the Route 66 of monster movies. A kitsch holdover of the 1950s. Nostalgia amplified nearly to the point of satire. It's a glimpse into that idealized, platonic, bygone era of the mid-century. Even that weird theme song is a poppy time capsule of 50s kitsch. The Midnight Monster movie scene is central to understanding the film, which no doubt contributes to it being the main thing people remember about it. So much so that it is annually reenacted at Phoenixville's Blob Fest. With its overbaked narration and seeming appearance as contextless stock footage, you would be forgiven for thinking that the film Daughter of Horror, being shown at the theater, was made up for the benefit of the Blob. A kind of satirical, made-up monster movie that is too cheesy to really exist. It actually does exist, though. Daughter of Horror is a real movie. It began life in 1955 as a controversial, avant-garde, experimental noir thriller called Dementia. Purporting to give a glimpse inside the mind of a murderess as she navigates the underworld of LA's Skid Row, the film is almost Lynchian in its oppressive atmosphere of psychological distress and its atypical narrative flow. So it, of course, got itself banned all over the place. An edited version of the film, with narration by Ed McMahon, of Tonight Show fame, was released in 1957 as Daughter of Horror. It hardly fared much better, though. It was still banned in the UK. So them watching the film in The Blob would be a bit like watching a midnight showing of Eraserhead. Very likely that the producers of The Blob picked Daughter of Horror exactly because the narration teeters it on the verge of absurdism. I can very much imagine rowdy teenagers in the 50s laughing and throwing popcorn at it. Which was the point. The scene is a glimpse into an aspect of 1950s culture, which is much of The Blob's appeal. A big part of the enjoyment of very era-specific films like this is that they are so steeped and contextualized in their time period. Dracula or Frankenstein are perpetually great, timeless films that happened to be made in the 30s. The Blob is great because it is so timely, because it was made in the 50s and couldn't have been made at any other time and been nearly as fun, as evidenced by its sequels and remakes. I'll also point out here the second film on the Midnight Movie double feature. The title isn't given, but a name is. Bela Lugosi. Lugosi had just passed away in 1956, a mere 2 years before The Blob was released. This is another glimpse into the time, and the currency Lugosi's name had in retrospectives after his passing. It's also a subtext of homage, connecting one of the best and most original 50s monsters to the creatures of Universal Studios and Hollywood's golden age. That connection was no mere pretension either. In the abundance of 50s sci-fi movie monsters, only 4 actually transcended to become true cultural icons, who sit comfortably with King Kong and the classic Gothic monsters: Godzilla, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Fly, and the Blob. There were no shortage of alien invaders and bug-eyed monsters in the 50s, from Gort and Day the Earth Stood Still, to the Metaluna mutant of This Island Earth, to the faceless, disembodied voices of Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, to the Martians of War of the Worlds, to Thing from Another World, and many, many, many more. What sets the Blob apart from so very many who have come and gone is that all of these are intelligences of some kind. Even if they are, in H.G. Wells' words, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic, they are, nonetheless, intellects. They are beings with minds. Sometimes they are not particularly humanoid. This was the central contention of Universal's It Came from Outer Space. But they still have identifiable features with which we can relate, like a face or even a single eyeball. And more importantly, they have a mind with which we can reason, or at least, give orders. Not so with the Blob. The Blob isn't any of those things. It isn't malicious or rational. It has no mind. It has no intelligent purpose, no goal. It cannot be reasoned with. It doesn't speak. It doesn't have a head or face or even an eyeball. There's nothing whatsoever human about it. It has no identifiable form at all. It would be difficult to say if it's even alive in the traditional sense of the term. It's not animal or vegetable or even mineral. We don't know what it is. It's just an all-consuming, irrational, hungering blob. And thus, the film is elevated beyond its limitations as yet another 50s alien invasion movie or even a Red Scare flick. Heck, even the term invasion implies purpose where there is none. The Blob is just a thing that happens. A freak accident of a meteor landing on a planet that sufficiently thaws this thing out after its voyage through the cold, dark vastness of space. Which makes the Blob a cosmic horror. Even the Shoggoths of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, the closest literary antecedent to the Blob, had an intelligence of a kind, even if it was of such a different kind from our own. The closest monsters to the Blob in its symbolic meaning are the zombies of George Romero's films or the xenomorphs of Ridley Scott's. Mindless killing machines representing the forces of chaos and meaninglessness in a violent and tropic universe hostile to life. The Blob is almost a film ahead of its time. Night of the Living Dead would come out an entire decade later. The deaths of the Blob are meaningless, accidental, wrong place, wrong time. The Blob is a cosmic horror and nihilistic chaos come down to a 1950s small town. Except for those hot-rodding teenagers. The bulwark of life and civilization and love and meaning against the all-consuming, hungering cosmic chaos is a band of hot-rodding 28-year-old teenagers bopping to a saxophone trill. Which is why I said the Blob is almost ahead of its time. It is ahead of its time in how it presents our protagonists as teenagers, who were typically a nuisance in the face of the very serious men of science and the military fighting off alien menaces, if they were in the film at all. The Blob differs by centering teenagers as the heroes, in a strategy that would be used in horror films for decades to come. Heck, The Blob even predates Beach Party by several years, the first of the, beach party movies that focus on the lives and libidos of teenagers. But it is almost ahead of its time as a horror sci-fi film, because in the end, it does affirm life and meaning and order. The town rallies around the kids, figure out a solution, and hold back the chaos for another day, so they can live their lives cruising around, watching midnight horror movies, eating burgers at the diner, rocking to the jukebox, and whatever else boomer kids did back then. Contrary to Wells and Lovecraft before it, or Romero and Scott afterward, The Blob knows that what makes life worth living is in these sorts of small towns with their small affairs and small joys. And in enjoying movies like The Blob, a nostalgic microcosm of 1950s culture that is something more than a weird, guilty pleasure to become an antidote to chaos and affirmation of life merely in the watching of the thing. Things like this movie are what make life worth living. The Blob, the movie, is meta-symbolic of itself. Of course, it still has to end with a question mark that has become ever more ominous today. And I'm not sure how much climate change was on the radar of the 1950s, but when Steve McQueen intones that we should be safe from the Blob so long as the Arctic stays cold, oh man. With that cryptic ending, The Blob retains its relevance. Its 50s nostalgia is the lion's share of its appeal. Its cosmic horror uplifts the material. And today, we can appreciate the film's perhaps unintentional prescience.